"Get out of my boardroom. You don't work here anymore. And frankly, I don't know what my son was thinking bringing someone like you into this building in the first place." Lenora just stood there. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She said, very quietly, "I understand, Mr. Whitmore," and she turned toward the door. That was when Philip Whitmore's phone rang. He didn't know it yet. But the woman walking out of his conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Capital was the reason every deal on that table existed at all. 2 hours earlier, the morning had looked like a triumph. The Whitmore Capital offices sat above Midtown Manhattan, all steel and glass and the kind of silence that cost money to maintain. The lobby floors were pale travertine. The elevator panels were brushed gold. Assistants moved in straight lines and spoke in measured tones, and the air itself carried the faint, expensive smell of leather and ambition. Lenora arrived at 7:45, which was earlier than anyone expected, and later than she usually worked. She wore a gray wool blazer she'd had for 11 years, dark slacks, and low-heeled shoes that made no sound on the travertine. No briefcase, no assistant trailing behind her. She carried a single legal pad and a pen she'd taken from a hotel in Cincinnati sometime around 2019 and never returned. The receptionist at the 42nd floor desk looked up and then looked again, the way people do when they're trying to decide if someone is lost. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see my son," Lenora said. "Callum Whitmore. He's expecting me." The receptionist glanced at the calendar, glanced back, and did a poor job of hiding her surprise. "1 moment, please." Callum appeared 2 minutes later, tall and a little nervous in the way he always was when his two worlds were about to collide. He kissed her cheek. "Mom, you look great. You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I haven't." She squeezed his arm. "Show me where to sit. I'll stay out of the way." That was, of course, exactly what she'd planned to do. Callum had married into the Whitmore family 3 years ago. Lenora had watched it happen with quiet joy and quieter worry. Her son loved Brooke Whitmore genuinely, which was what mattered most. But Philip Whitmore, Brooke's father, had made his feelings about the match known in the way powerful men always do. Not in shouting, but in the steady, grinding pressure of small comments at dinners and cold silences in elevators, and the particular way he looked at Callum as though calculating what he had cost and whether the cost could be recovered. He had never once looked at Lenora directly. She didn't mind. She was used to being underestimated. She had, in fact, spent a considerable portion of her adult life cultivating it. Lenora was 53. She had gray threading through her hair that she had never colored and no intention of starting now. She wore clothes that were well-made but not loud, drove a car that was reliable but not remarkable, and kept an apartment in a neighborhood that was comfortable but not the neighborhood people expected. She answered her own phone. She carried her own bags. She tipped generously and remembered names the way other people remembered faces, with ease and without effort. Her own name she kept quiet, not hidden, exactly. If anyone had looked up Lenora Vance in the right places, they would have found her. But no one at Whitmore Capital had looked, because no one at Whitmore Capital had thought to. She was just Callum's mother, the woman from Ohio, the one who came in a gray blazer and sat in the back of the room. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:50, the long conference room was filling with men in charcoal suits and women in structured dresses, all of them circling the beverage station and talking about the deal on the table, a merger that would either double Whitmore Capital's reach or leave it dangerously overextended, depending on who you ask. Lenora sat in a chair near the window, legal pad on her knee, and listened. She heard the things people say when they think no one important is paying attention. They think they can close this without the Vance portfolio backing it. A man in a navy suit near the wall, speaking to another man with a coffee he wasn't drinking. Philip thinks the Vance people are locked in. He hasn't confirmed it in writing. If that falls through, it won't fall through. Philip's certain. Philip's always certain. A short, uncomfortable laugh, and then the two men drifted apart. Lenora wrote nothing on the legal pad. She just listened. Brooke found her 20 minutes before the meeting began. Brooke was 31, warm and perceptive, and one of the only people in this building who had ever sat across from Lenora over a meal and asked her real questions instead of polite ones. She had, in 3 years of marriage, never treated her mother-in-law as a category. "You didn't have to come all the way up," Brooke said, sitting beside her. "I know these things aren't your idea of fun. I like watching people, Lenora said. Always have. Brooke smiled. Dad's a little wound up this morning. There's a lot riding on today. There usually is, Lenora said. She said it gently, without irony, and Brooke heard it the way she was meant to. The meeting started at 9:02. Philip Whitmore took the head of the table, and the room organized itself around him, the way rooms always organized themselves around men who expected it. He was 64, broad-shouldered, still handsome in the way that money and certainty preserve, and he moved through the world with the absolute conviction of a man who had never been told no in a room that mattered. He did not acknowledge Lenora when he walked past. She didn't expect him to. The first 40 minutes were procedural, projections, risk analysis, a presentation by a young associate who spoke too fast and knew it. Lenora followed it all without any visible reaction. She had sat in enough of these rooms. She knew how the language worked, where the soft spots were, what the numbers on the left side of the slide were hiding. The trouble started just before 10. A woman named Diane Forsyth, Whitmore's head of external relations, was walking the room through the partnership structure when one of the board members, a man named Gerald Ashby, who had the air of someone who had been important for so long that he'd forgotten how he got there, cleared his throat and interrupted. This all assumes the Vance commitment holds. Diane paused. Yes, the Vance Foundation has indicated strong. Indicated. Ashby set down his pen. Not confirmed. We're in final discussions. It's a $2 billion cornerstone position. Final discussions isn't a contract. The room shifted. Philip Whitmore's jaw tightened very slightly. He didn't like being interrupted, and he liked being exposed even less. The Vance commitment will hold, he said. I've had assurances directly. Assurances from whom? Ashby pressed. From the Foundation's executive office. Ashby looked unconvinced. Because from what I understand, the Vance Foundation's chair has been unusually quiet this quarter. Nobody's seen her at the usual events. Nobody's spoken to her directly. If she's pulling back, she's not pulling back, Philip said. How do you know? Philip's voice went flat and certain. Because I know how these things work. The Vance Foundation has been a reliable partner for 15 years. They're not going to walk away from a deal of this size over nothing. Lenora, from her chair near the window, said nothing. She looked out at the skyline, gray morning light on glass towers, a pigeon on the window ledge deciding whether to stay, and then Philip Whitmore, apparently deciding that certainty required a supporting cast, turned toward the end of the table where Callum was sitting, and said, in the tone of a man who already knows the answer, "Your mother does some kind of consulting work in Ohio, doesn't she? Some nonprofit board?" He looked at Lenora now, finally with the particular attention of someone who has just thought of a use for you. Maybe she could speak to what smaller foundations are doing in this space. Background color. He meant it as a small, kind condescension, a way to make the gray blazer woman from Ohio feel included without actually including her. The room waited politely. Callum went very still. Lenora looked at Philip Whitmore for the first time all morning. She smiled. Not the smile of a woman being offered something, but the smile of someone who has just decided to accept an invitation she's been holding in her coat pocket for an hour. I suppose I could offer some perspective, she said. If it's helpful. By all means, Philip said. She set her legal pad on her knee and folded her hands over it. What you're describing as the Vance commitment, she said, is a cornerstone position of $2 billion contingent on 3 conditions. The first is governance reform, specifically 2 independent board seats with real authority, not advisory roles. The second is a reporting structure that runs directly to the Foundation's executive chair quarterly, in writing, no intermediaries. The third, and the one your current proposal does not meet, is a cap on leverage ratio that your slide from 20 minutes ago put at 14% above the agreed threshold. The room had gone very quiet. Gerald Ashby's pen was resting on the table. He wasn't moving it. Philip Whitmore was staring at her. Lenora continued in the same calm voice she used for everything. I know these conditions because I wrote them. I'm Lenora Vance. I chair the Vance Foundation. And I came here this morning because my son invited me, and because I wanted to see this operation the way you see it when you think the only person watching is a woman in a gray blazer who doesn't matter. She let that land. She didn't fill the silence with anything. Across the table, a younger board member named Tara Okafor had her hands flat on the table and was staring at Lenora with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite succeeding. Philip Whitmore's face had gone through several colors and settled on something between white and gray. He said. You're Lenora Vance. I am. But you came in with Callum. You were sitting in the back. I know where I was sitting. Why didn't you? He stopped. Why didn't someone tell me? Callum said, from his end of the table very quietly. I told you 6 months ago that my mother was connected to the foundation. You said, and I'm paraphrasing, that you were glad to have the personal introduction if I could arrange it. Philip's eyes moved to his son-in-law with an expression that was doing its best to look like confusion and was actually something closer to the beginning of understanding how much damage had been done. The room was still not making any sounds. This is when Diane Forsyth, God bless her, cleared her throat and said, "Perhaps we should take a short break." "No," Lenora said, and it wasn't rude, it was just clear. "I'd rather finish." She turned back to Philip. "I want to be precise about something. I came here as a mother, not as a chair. I wanted to see this office, this team, this culture, because my son is building a life inside it. I've watched you for 3 years. I've watched how you speak to Callum in meetings. I've watched how you describe him to your board members, and I've heard the word liability used in a context where it should not have been applied to a person. I've watched how your staff behaves when they're not being observed, which tells you considerably more than how they behave when they are." She paused. "I was going to have a different conversation with you this week, a quiet one, through the proper channels, about the leverage condition and the board seat structure. Instead, I'm having this one." She looked at him, steadily, without heat, without pleasure. "I don't need Whitmore Capital, Mr. Whitmore. You need the Vance Foundation. That distinction matters, and I want you to understand it clearly before we go any further." Philip opened his mouth, closed it. He looked like a man who had just had the ground removed from beneath a building he'd been very confident about. Gerald Ashby said quietly, "Well," which was not nothing. Philip recovered in the way men like him recover. Not gracefully, but fast. He was already rearranging, already finding the angle that put him back in control, or at least in the frame. "Lenora," he said, and the shift to her first name was a tell. "Whatever my personal failings, this deal is sound. The terms you've outlined are workable. We can meet the governance conditions, we can restructure the leverage cap, and I think if we sit down, just the two of us, we can find a framework that works for everyone." Lenora looked at him for a moment. She thought of Callum at 24, calling her from a parking lot in Chicago because his first job interview had gone wrong and he didn't know how to drive home yet. She thought of him at 30, careful and earnest, and trying so hard to build something in a world that was not always kind to careful, earnest people. She thought about the word liability. She said, "The meeting between us won't be just the two of us. It will include Callum, and your daughter, and your board chair, because what I have to say about governance applies to how this firm treats its family members as well as its foundation partners." Philip's jaw shifted. "That's not standard procedure." "No," she said, "it isn't." She picked up her legal pad. "I'll be in New York through Friday. My office will send the meeting parameters by noon. I'd encourage you to come prepared to listen rather than to negotiate." She stood, and the room stood with her, not all at once, but in the ripple that moves through people when they understand, without being told, that the center of gravity has changed. At the door she stopped. She turned back to Philip, and her voice was even and not unkind. "I want to be clear about something else. I'm not withdrawing the Foundation's interest. This deal still has merit. The team on your research side," she nodded toward Tara Okafor, "is doing exceptional work, and I've read their modeling. This isn't about punishment, it's about alignment." She let that sit for one beat. What happens to a firm when it values the right things shows up eventually. In the numbers, in the culture, in who stays and who leaves. I've been watching long enough to know. Then she walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound that was not dramatic, just the ordinary click of a latch. In the corridor, Callum caught up with her at the elevator bank. "Mom," she pressed the button. The down arrow lit. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him. He had his father's jaw, her eyes, and a worried expression that was entirely his own. "I'm fine," she said. "I've been fine. I was fine in there. I know, She touched his arm. "You chose to bring me here. You chose to tell me the truth about this place." "That's not nothing, Callum," he exhaled. The elevator opened. She stepped in and turned around and looked at her son, standing in the corridor of a building that had never fully welcomed him and might never fully understand the woman who had just sat quietly in its back corner for 4 hours. "Friday," she said. "We'll sort it out." The doors closed. What happened after was not fast, but it was thorough. The meeting on Friday included all 4 people Lenora had named. It lasted 3 hours. Philip Whitmore came in with a revised terms sheet, which was a sign that he was smarter than his worst moments, and he listened in the way people listen when they understand that the alternative is worse. He didn't apologize, not in so many words, but he said, twice, that he had not fully understood the situation, which from a man like Philip was as close as you were likely to get. Callum sat beside his wife. Brooke held his hand under the table, which Lenora saw and didn't mention. The governance conditions were met, the leverage cap was restructured. The 2 independent board seats were named, and neither of them was decorative. The deal closed 6 weeks later. The press release described it as a landmark partnership between Whitmore Capital and the Vance Foundation, which it was. What it did not describe, because the press release was written by professionals, was the Tuesday morning in September when the chair of one of the country's most significant private foundations had sat in a chair by a window with a Cincinnati hotel pen and listened to a room underestimate her, and said nothing, and waited. Anderson Industries never had a Harrison Davis, but every boardroom has its version of that morning. The thing is, Philip Whitmore did not collapse. He did not fall to his knees on a marble floor. He didn't get dragged out in handcuffs or lose the company overnight. Real power doesn't usually operate in those kinds of scenes. It operates in silence, in the decision made on a Friday, in the board seat that changes the structure of how a firm makes choices for the next 20 years. Lenora Vance went back to Ohio on Saturday morning. She drove herself to the airport. She carried her own bag. She wore a jacket she'd had since 2016. At the gate, a young woman working the desk looked up and said, "Have a good flight, ma'am." And Lenora said, "Thank you, sweetheart," and meant it. On the plane, she opened a book she'd been working through for 2 weeks. She didn't think about the deal. She didn't think about Philip Whitmore's face when the room went quiet. She thought about Callum, about the hand his wife had held under the table, about the fact that in 6 weeks when this closed, he would have helped build something real inside a firm that was going to be, slowly and with friction, better than it had been. That was worth more than a collapse. That was the whole point. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been sitting in that boardroom, not as the chair, not with the cards, just as someone watching it happen, watching a woman get talked past, talked around, handed the role of background color while the real conversation moved on without her, what would you have done? Would you have said something? Would you have stayed quiet and told yourself it wasn't your place? Would you have waited for someone else to fix it first? Be honest. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story said something true to you, about patience, about power, about the particular cost of being underestimated by people who should have known better, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like it, subscribe, and come back for the next one, because the quietest person in the room is almost never the least powerful one. They're just the one who doesn't need you to know it yet.